The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the absence of sound, but something worse. The presence of sounds that don't belong in any universe where human beings are meant to exist. The whisper of air through passages carved from materials that hurt to look at directly. The distant echo of laughter that contains no warmth, no joy, only the cruel amusement of predators who have found new prey. The soft hum of technology so advanced and alien that your mind recoils from trying to understand it. My name is Lieutenant Sarah Chen, formerly of the 23rd Vostroyan Firstborn, currently designation Subject 47 in what my captors call their collection. 3 weeks ago, I was leading a reconnaissance patrol on the world of Kythera Prime, searching for signs of pirate activity in the outer settlements. Today, I am property of beings whose very existence is an affront to everything the Imperium teaches about humanity's place in the galaxy. The raid had come without warning, as their raids always did. One moment, our patrol was investigating reports of missing colonists from Settlement Gamma 7. The next, the sky itself seemed to tear open, revealing angular shapes that moved with impossible grace and speed. Their ships were works of art and instruments of terror in equal measure. Beautiful in the way that a blade is beautiful, elegant, purposeful, and utterly deadly. I had heard stories, of course. Every Imperial Guard officer was briefed on the various Xynos threats that plagued human space. The orcs with their crude brutality and love of violence. The Tyranids with their endless hunger for biomass. The enigmatic Eldar with their arrogance and contempt for younger races. But nothing in the briefings had prepared me for the reality of facing beings whose entire civilization was built around the infliction of suffering. They called themselves the Drukhari, though the Imperial designation was Dark Eldar, a name that barely began to capture the horror of what they represented. Where their craft world cousins sought to preserve their dying race through discipline and restraint, the Drukhari had chosen a different path. They fed on pain, on terror, on the slow dissolution of hope in the hearts of their victims. They were vampires in the truest sense, sustaining their immortal existence by drinking deep from the well of mortal agony. The attack itself had been a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. They could have killed us all in seconds with their advanced weaponry, but that would have been wasteful. Dead meat held no value to beings who fed on living terror. Instead, they used weapons designed to incapacitate rather than kill, neural disruptors that left victims conscious but paralyzed, toxin darts that induced helplessness without causing unconsciousness, gravity nets that trapped their prey without damaging the merchandise. I watched my squad die around me, not from the aliens' weapons, but from their own terror. Corporal Martinez, veteran of a dozen campaigns, suffered a heart attack when he saw what the raiders were doing to the colonists they had already captured. Sergeant Reynolds, a man I had trusted with my life on countless occasions, put his last pistol to his own head rather than face capture. Private Chen, no relation despite the shared name, simply curled up in a ball and began screaming, his mind snapping under the weight of horrors it was never meant to process. Only 3 of us were taken alive from that patrol. Myself, Private Kowalski, and Medic Helena Voss. We were loaded onto their skimmers like cargo, shackled with restraints that seemed to be made of crystallized darkness, and transported to their waiting vessels. The last thing I saw of Kythera Prime was the settlement burning in the distance, its population either dead or disappeared into the holds of alien raiders. The interior of their ship was a nightmare of organic architecture and impossible geometry. Corridors that seemed to twist back on themselves, chambers that were larger inside than their external dimensions should have allowed, passages that sloped upward but somehow led down. The walls themselves appeared to be alive, pulsing with a faint bioluminescence that cast everything in shades of purple and sickly green. But it was the decorations that truly drove home the reality of our situation. The walls were lined with what I initially took to be artistic sculptures, until I realized they were the preserved remains of previous captives. Humans, yes, but also members of other species I couldn't identify. Twisted into poses of eternal agony, their faces frozen in expressions of terminal despair. Some had been flayed, their skin removed with surgical precision and mounted like trophies. Others had been modified in ways that suggested experimentation rather than simple torture. "Welcome to the Razor's Edge," our captor announced in fluent Gothic, though his accent made each word sound like a blade drawn across bone. He was tall even by Eldar standards, perhaps 8 feet in height, with the pale, flawless features of his kind. But where the craft world Eldar I had encountered in intelligence briefings seemed aloof and ethereal, this being radiated malevolence like heat from a flame. His name, he told us, was Archon Valeris Shadowthorn, though he made it clear that we were not to address him directly unless given permission. We were his property now, and property did not speak to its owner without invitation. The fact that he spoke our language at all was not courtesy but practicality. It made the process of breaking us down more efficient if we could understand what was happening to us. "You are wondering, perhaps, what fate awaits you in the dark city of Kamara," he continued, circling around us as we knelt in the ship's holding chamber. "Some of you may harbor hopes of rescue, of escape, of eventual return to your primitive little empire. Allow me to disabuse you of such fantasies." He activated a holographic display that showed images of previous captives, documented throughout their captivity from the moment of capture to their eventual disposal. The progression was horrifying. Proud Imperial soldiers gradually reduced to broken shadows of themselves, their dignity stripped away layer by layer until nothing remained but raw nerve endings and the capacity to suffer. The average lifespan of a human slave in Kamara is approximately 7 Terra Standard years, Valeris explained with the tone of someone discussing weather conditions. Some last longer if they prove particularly entertaining or useful. Others burn out within months, their minds snapping under pressures they were never designed to endure. The duration of your existence depends entirely on how much amusement you can provide for your betters. Helena broke first. The medic who had patched up countless wounded soldiers, who had maintained her composure under the heaviest enemy fire, began to weep when she saw what was displayed on the hologram. Her sobs echoed through the chamber, and I watched Valeris smile, not with pleasure exactly, but with the satisfaction of someone whose professional skills were being validated. "Excellent," he murmured, fear mixed with despair, seasoned with just the right amount of defiance. "You will provide excellent sport in the arenas, assuming you survive the initial conditioning process." The journey to Komarok took what felt like weeks, though time had no meaning in the webway passages the Dark Elder used to travel between realms. We were kept in individual cells that were too small to stand in, but too narrow to lie down in, forcing us into uncomfortable positions that gradually wore down our physical and mental resistance. Food consisted of a gray paste that tasted like ash mixed with copper, while water was provided in quantities just sufficient to prevent death from dehydration. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological torture they inflicted simply through their presence. Our captors would visit us regularly, not to interrogate or abuse us, but simply to observe our deterioration with the clinical interest of scientists studying lab specimens. They discussed our condition in our hearing, comparing notes on our rate of mental degradation and speculating about how long each of us might last under different stress conditions. The female officer shows promising resilience, I overheard one of them saying during what might have been my second week in captivity. Her conditioning as a military leader has given her useful survival instincts, but those same instincts will make her fall all the more satisfying when they inevitably fail her. They spoke about us as if we were livestock being evaluated for market, which in many ways was exactly what we were. The Dark Eldar economy was built on suffering, and we represented valuable commodities in a marketplace where the currency was measured in screams and broken spirits. Our worth would be determined by how much entertainment our destruction could provide for beings who had exhausted every other form of amusement. Kowalski died during the journey, though not from anything our captors did to him directly. The young private simply gave up. One morning I heard him talking to himself in his cell, rambling about his family back on Vostroya, about the girl he had planned to marry when his tour of duty ended. By evening, he had stopped talking entirely. By the next morning, he had stopped breathing. The Dark Eldar were mildly annoyed by his death, not because they felt any sympathy for him, but because it represented a loss of potential profit. They discussed the disposal of his body with the same tone they might use for broken equipment, debating whether his corpse had any value as raw materials or decorative elements. Weak-willed specimens rarely provide adequate entertainment, Valeris observed, as they carried Kowalski's body away. Perhaps the breeding programs on your pathetic little worlds need to select for stronger mental characteristics. We shall have to pass this information along to our raiding commanders. The idea that they were treating our deaths as market research, that our suffering was being analyzed to improve future harvests of human misery, was somehow worse than any direct cruelty they could have inflicted. We were not even worthy enemies in their eyes. We were simply resources to be optimized for maximum yield. When we finally arrived in Kamara, the first sight of the Dark City made my sanity reel like a ship in a storm. The place defied every law of physics and architecture that human minds were capable of processing. Spires twisted impossibly upward into darkness, connected by bridges that seemed to be made of crystallized screams. Entire districts hung inverted from what should have been the sky, while others existed in dimensions that folded back on themselves in ways that made my eyes water to perceive. But it was the scale that truly overwhelmed comprehension. Komarog was not just a city. It was the entire civilization built within the webway, a pocket dimension that existed parallel to real space. Millions of Dark Eldar made their homes in its twisted districts, each one a predator sustained by the suffering of beings from across the galaxy. The population of slaves necessary to sustain such a place was beyond calculation, drawn from every species unfortunate enough to encounter their raiders. The slave markets where we were taken for processing were located in what our escorts called the lower reaches, vast caverns filled with cages, processing stations, and sorting facilities. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, industrial chemicals, and something else that I gradually identified as concentrated despair made manifest. Thousands of beings from dozens of different species filled the holding areas, all of them waiting to be evaluated, categorized, and sold to buyers whose purposes ranged from labor to entertainment to experimentation. "Fresh meat from the Rim territories," announced the slave master who received us, a grotesque figure whose body had been so extensively modified that it was difficult to determine what he might originally have been. Multiple arms ended in surgical implements and data probes, while his face had been replaced entirely with some kind of optical analysis device. Imperial Guard, by the look of them. Decent physical condition, minimal obvious mutations, should fetch reasonable prices in the gladiator markets. Helena and I were separated during the processing phase, loaded into different transport cages, and moved to separate evaluation centers. I never saw her again, though sometimes in the depths of my current existence I think I can hear her screaming somewhere in the distance. Whether this is memory, imagination, or some psychic echo of her ongoing torment, I cannot say. My own evaluation was conducted by a being who introduced herself as Homunculus Zyra the Fleshright, a title that made my skin crawl before I even understood what it meant. She was ancient even by Eldar standards, her original form so heavily modified by surgical enhancement and biomechanical augmentation that she barely resembled anything that had ever been organic. Her fingers had been replaced with an array of medical instruments, while her eyes were complex optical devices that could apparently see through flesh to examine bone and organ structure. "Interesting," she murmured as her scanners played over my body. 32 standard years of age, excellent physical conditioning, minimal scarring despite extensive combat experience. The mind shows signs of command conditioning and tactical training. Yes, this one has potential for any number of amusing modifications. She made notations on a device that looked like living crystal, recording data about my physiological and psychological condition with the thoroughness of someone preparing for major surgery. Every aspect of my being was cataloged and evaluated, not as a person, but as raw material that could be shaped into whatever form might provide the most entertainment value. "The question," she continued, speaking to an assistant whose form was hidden beneath robes that seemed to writhe with their own life, "is whether to preserve the original psychological template or modify it for enhanced emotional responsiveness. Military conditioning creates useful resilience, but it also dampens the fear responses that make for proper entertainment value." They discussed my future as if I were not present, debating various surgical and chemical modifications that could enhance my value as a gladiator, experimental subject, or decorative element. The casual way they planned to reshape my body and mind was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire experience. I was not being tortured for information or killed for military purposes, but simply processed like livestock according to market demands. The modifications began immediately, not the dramatic reconstructive surgery that would come later, but subtle chemical and neural alterations designed to make me more suitable for my intended role. Drugs that enhanced pain sensitivity while preventing unconsciousness. Neural implants that amplified emotional responses while suppressing logical thought processes. Surgical modifications to bone and muscle structure that would improve my performance in combat while ensuring I could never be quite strong enough to threaten my captors. Each procedure was performed with the clinical precision of master surgeons, but also with an artistic flair that spoke to their creators' aesthetic sensibilities. The Dark Eldar did not simply modify their slaves, they sculpted them, turning living beings into works of art that happened to be capable of suffering. Every cut was measured, every enhancement calculated to create maximum impact when displayed before audiences of connoisseurs. But perhaps most horrifying of all was the realization that they were not just changing my body, they were changing my mind. The neural modifications they implanted gradually altered my thought patterns, making me more aggressive, more responsive to pain, more capable of violence but less capable of planning or abstract reasoning. I could feel my personality dissolving under the assault of artificial chemicals and surgical interventions, replaced by something that was designed to provide entertainment rather than think independently. The person who had been Lieutenant Sarah Chen was dying by degrees, replaced by something that looked like her, but thought and felt according to parameters established by alien beings whose only concern was the optimization of their entertainment. It was a violation more complete than any physical assault, the systematic destruction of everything that made me human. The training that followed the initial modifications was designed to complete the transformation from human being to performing animal. I was placed in a facility that the Dark Eldar called an academy, though it bore no resemblance to any educational institution that existed in Imperial space. Here, captured beings from across the galaxy were taught to fight, to suffer, and to die in ways that would provide maximum entertainment value for audiences of bored immortals. My instructors were themselves modified slaves, beings who had once been proud warriors from a dozen different species, but had been broken down and rebuilt to serve as training tools. They taught combat techniques, pain tolerance, and most importantly, how to lose in spectacular fashion when the entertainment demanded it. Victory was not the goal. Spectacle was what mattered. The artful presentation of violence and suffering in forms that could move even the jaded sensibilities of creatures who had witnessed every conceivable form of horror. "You must understand," explained my primary trainer, a being who had once been a space marine but was now something that barely resembled humanity, "that your purpose is not to win, but to provide a worthy performance. The audience comes to see beauty in destruction, art in agony, meaning in meaninglessness. If you simply fight to survive, you will bore them, and bored Drukhari are dangerous Drukhari." The other students in the academy came from across the galaxy, proud Tau warriors who had been modified to enhance their natural martial arts abilities, orc fighters whose natural brutality had been refined into something approaching elegance. Even a few Eldar from the craft worlds who had been captured during raids and turned into living demonstrations of their species' fall from grace. We trained together, but we were also encouraged to see each other as competitors for the limited number of slots in the more prestigious arena events. The Dark Eldar understood that desperation made for better performances, so they created artificial scarcity around the opportunities they offered their slaves. Better to fight for the chance to die entertainingly than to simply accept death passively. The physical training was brutal but professional. Our instructors knew exactly how far they could push each species without causing permanent damage that would interfere with performance capabilities. They enhanced our natural abilities while introducing carefully calculated weaknesses that would ensure we could never pose a real threat to our captors. We became faster, stronger, more resilient to injury, but also more dependent on the drugs and modifications they provided to maintain those enhancements. But it was the psychological conditioning that truly transformed us from individuals into entertainment products. Through a combination of chemical manipulation, neural programming, and simple behavioral conditioning, they gradually eroded our sense of self-worth and personal identity. We learned to measure our value only in terms of how much amusement we could provide for our owners, to find pride only in the perfection of our performances rather than in any independent accomplishment. The process was insidious because it felt like genuine improvement. The modifications made us stronger, faster, more capable of surviving in combat. The training provided skills and knowledge that no human warrior in Imperial space could match. The psychological conditioning reduced the anxiety and fear that might otherwise have paralyzed us in combat situations. By every objective measure, we were being enhanced rather than degraded. Except that the purpose of all these enhancements was to make us better at being destroyed for the amusement of beings who valued nothing beyond their own entertainment. We were being turned into masterpieces of applied cruelty, works of art whose medium was suffering and whose audience was composed entirely of monsters. My first performance in the arenas came after 6 months of modification and training. I was assigned to participate in a historical recreation, a staged battle that supposedly depicted some ancient conflict between human and Xenos forces. My role was to play an Imperial Guard officer leading a desperate last stand against overwhelming odds, a performance that would end with my inevitable defeat and hopefully spectacular death. The arena itself was a masterwork of engineering and artistry, a vast amphitheater that could be reconfigured to represent any environment or historical period. For our performance, it had been transformed into a ruined imperial shrine, complete with collapsed statuary and burning wreckage that provided both cover and atmospheric lighting. The attention to detail was perfect, every element designed to create maximum emotional impact on an audience that included some of the most powerful beings in Dark Eldar society. My opponents were professionally trained gladiators, slaves who had survived long enough in the arenas to develop genuine skill and experience. They knew how to make a fight look desperate and uncertain while maintaining complete control over its outcome. Their job was to kill me slowly, artfully, in a manner that would provide the maximum entertainment value while appearing to be the result of natural combat progression. But as the battle began, something went wrong with their carefully orchestrated plan. The neural modifications they had made to enhance my combat reflexes proved to be more effective than anyone had anticipated. The training they had provided to make me a better performer had also made me a genuinely dangerous opponent. When the lead gladiator moved in for what should have been the opening wound of my ritual destruction, I reacted with speed and precision that surprised everyone, including myself. The gladiator died with my improvised blade between his ribs, his expression showing genuine shock that a new slave had managed to penetrate his defenses. The second opponent hesitated for just a moment, confused by the deviation from the planned choreography, and that hesitation cost him his life as well. Within minutes, all 4 of my designated killers lay dead at my feet, while I stood bleeding but victorious in the center of the arena. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any roar of approval could have been. Thousands of Dark Eldar stared down at me with expressions that ranged from surprise to outrage to something that might have been professional interest. I had violated the fundamental rule of arena combat by actually winning when I was supposed to lose, and the consequences of that violation were uncertain but undoubtedly severe. Archon Valeris himself descended to the arena floor, moving with the fluid grace that marked all of his kind, but also with the controlled anger of someone whose property had malfunctioned in public. When he reached me, I expected immediate execution for my failure to follow the prescribed script. Instead, he studied me with the calculating gaze of someone reassessing a business investment. "Unexpected," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's acoustics. "The modifications appear to have produced results beyond design specifications. This raises interesting questions about the optimization of our enhancement procedures." He circled around me, examining the bodies of the gladiators I had killed with the detached interest of someone evaluating a piece of malfunctioning equipment. The question now becomes whether this represents a valuable accident that should be preserved and studied, or a dangerous deviation that requires immediate correction. The crowd had begun to murmur among themselves, their voices creating a susurrus of alien conversation that I couldn't understand, but which clearly indicated significant interest in my case. Some seemed to be placing bets on my fate, while others appeared to be debating the artistic merits of my performance. To them, my unexpected victory was not a triumph, but a curiosity, an interesting deviation from normal procedure that might have entertainment value if properly exploited. "We shall preserve this specimen for further study," Valeris announced to the crowd. "The enhancement process that produced such unexpected results may have applications for other subjects. In the meantime, she will be transferred to the individual combatant division for evaluation of her long-term entertainment potential." I was removed from the arena and taken to different quarters. Not better conditions exactly, but different ones suited to my new status as a special case, rather than routine merchandise. My cell was larger and included basic training equipment, while my food improved from gray paste to something that almost resembled actual nutrition. But I was also subjected to more intensive study, as various homunculi came to examine the modifications that had produced my unexpected performance. "Fascinating," murmured homunculus Zyra during one of these examinations. "The neural enhancement matrix appears to have created feedback loops with the subject's original conditioning, amplifying both combat reflexes and tactical reasoning beyond projected parameters. This could represent a significant breakthrough in slave modification techniques." She made extensive notes about my condition, recording data that would presumably be used to improve future enhancement procedures. The fact that I had killed 4 experienced gladiators was less important to her than understanding how the modifications had produced that result. I was not a person who had achieved something remarkable, but a test case that had generated useful data for refining industrial processes. The individual combatant division operated according to different rules than the mass entertainment spectacles. Here, slaves fought one-on-one battles against opponents chosen to provide specific types of challenge and entertainment. The contests were smaller but more intimate, attended by connoisseurs who appreciated subtlety and skill over simple brutality. Victory was still not the ultimate goal. The goal was always to provide entertaining performances, but the standards for what constituted entertainment were more sophisticated. My opponents were carefully selected to test different aspects of my enhanced capabilities. Enhanced humans who had been modified in different ways, providing comparison data for various enhancement techniques. Xenos warriors whose natural abilities created specific tactical challenges. Even a few Dark Eldar who had been enslaved for various transgressions against their own society. Beings whose fall from grace provided additional entertainment value for the watching crowds. Each battle taught me something new about what I had become and what I was capable of achieving. The modifications had not just enhanced my physical abilities, they had fundamentally altered the way my mind processed combat information. I could see patterns in my opponent's movements that would have been invisible to my original consciousness, anticipate their actions with precision that bordered on precognition, respond to threats with speed that surprised even my enhanced reflexes. But I was also becoming something that was no longer entirely human. The chemical modifications had altered my emotional responses, making me calmer in combat, but also less capable of forming emotional connections with other beings. The neural implants had enhanced my tactical reasoning, but also reduced my capacity for abstract thought and moral reflection. I was becoming a perfect weapon, and in the process, losing everything that had made me a person worth preserving. The victories continued, each one extending my lifespan, while also deepening my transformation into something alien to my original nature. I defeated enhanced humans, Xenos warriors, even captured space marines, whose legendary prowess proved insufficient against opponents who had been specifically designed to exploit their weaknesses. With each victory, I earned more time alive, more opportunities to discover what I was becoming. But survival in the arenas was not just about combat skill. It was about understanding the complex social dynamics of Dark Eldar society and learning to navigate them without triggering the kind of boredom that meant immediate disposal. I had to become not just a warrior, but a performer, someone who could provide entertainment value beyond simple victory or defeat. The Dark Eldar who attended the combats were not a homogeneous audience. Different factions within their society had different tastes in entertainment, different aesthetic preferences, different standards for what constituted quality performance. Learning to read these preferences and adjust my fighting style accordingly became as important as learning to defeat my opponents. Some preferred elegant, technical combat that demonstrated precision and skill. Others wanted brutal, visceral battles that showcased the physical destruction of living beings. A few enjoyed psychological drama, contests where the real battle was between competing philosophies or worldviews, rather than simply between physical opponents. Adapting to these different requirements while maintaining the enhancements that kept me alive became a complex balancing act that required constant attention. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the gradual realization that I was beginning to enjoy the performances. The modifications had not just enhanced my combat abilities, they had altered my reward mechanisms, making me derive genuine pleasure from activities that should have horrified my original consciousness. The roar of the crowd, the moment of victory over a fallen opponent, the satisfaction of a perfectly executed combat maneuver, all of it triggered artificial but genuine feelings of accomplishment and joy. I was not just being forced to perform for my captor's entertainment. I was being programmed to want to perform, to find meaning and satisfaction in activities that served their purposes rather than my own. The psychological conditioning was turning me into a willing participant in my own exploitation, someone who genuinely believed that providing entertainment for my owners was a worthy goal in itself. Years passed in this existence, though time had little meaning in the depths of Kamara, where day and night were artificial concepts determined by the whims of the ruling elite. I fought hundreds of battles, defeated countless opponents, provided entertainment for audiences whose sophistication in appreciating suffering far exceeded their capacity for any other form of art or culture. With each passing season, I became more skilled, more enhanced, more perfectly adapted to my role as a premium entertainment asset. But I also became less human, less capable of remembering what I had been before the modifications began reshaping my body and mind. The woman who had been Lieutenant Sarah Chen existed only in fragmentary memories that seemed increasingly like stories someone else had told me about a person I had never actually been. The Dark Eldar had achieved something that simple torture or murder could never have accomplished. They had made me complicit in my own destruction, transformed me into someone who genuinely believed that my current existence was preferable to whatever I had been before. They had not just broken my body or shattered my mind. They had rewritten the fundamental code of my identity so thoroughly that I could no longer imagine wanting to be anything other than what they had made me. But success in the arenas brought its own dangers. As my reputation grew and my performances became more sophisticated, I attracted the attention of increasingly powerful figures within Dark Eldar society. Beings whose boredom was so profound that they required ever more elaborate forms of stimulation to feel anything at all. My victories had made me valuable, but value in Kamara was always a temporary condition subject to the changing tastes of immortal beings who had exhausted every other form of amusement. The invitation came from Asdrubal Vecht himself, the supreme overlord of Kamara, the being whose will shaped the destiny of the entire Dark City. He had heard of the modified human who had achieved unexpected success in the individual combat divisions and wished to evaluate my potential for inclusion in his personal collection of exotic entertainment assets. The summons was delivered by one of Vect's personal representatives, a being so heavily modified that determining his original species was impossible. His message was simple and non-negotiable. I would be transported to the pinnacle of agonies, Vect's personal fortress at the heart of Kamara, where I would undergo evaluation for potential service in the most exclusive entertainment venues in the Dark City. The journey to the pinnacle took me through districts of Kamara that I had never seen before, areas reserved for the most powerful members of Dark Eldar society, where the architecture itself was a weapon designed to induce madness in lesser beings. Spires that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Gardens where the plants were cultivated torture victims whose screams had been transformed into visual art. Museums displaying the preserved remains of entire civilizations that had been harvested for their entertainment value. But it was the pinnacle itself that truly demonstrated the scope of Vect's power and the depths of his corruption. The fortress was not just a building, but a pocket dimension unto itself, a realm where the laws of physics bent to accommodate the whims of its owner. Reality itself became malleable within its walls, shaped and reshaped according to aesthetic preferences that had been refined over millennia of absolute power. The evaluation process was unlike anything I had experienced in the lower arenas. Instead of simple combat trials, I was subjected to tests that examined every aspect of my modified nature: physical, mental, emotional, and psychological. Teams of experts analyzed my performance under various stress conditions, studying the ways that different forms of pressure affected my combat effectiveness and entertainment value. "Remarkable adaptation," observed one of the evaluators, a homunculus whose expertise lay in the psychological modification of captured beings. The subject has not just accepted her conditioning, but has internalized it completely. She genuinely believes that her current existence represents an improvement over her original state. They spoke about me as if I were not present, discussing my modifications and capabilities with the clinical detachment of researchers studying a particularly interesting specimen. But they were not wrong in their assessment. I did believe that my current existence was preferable to whatever I had been before. The modifications had been so thorough, so carefully integrated into my fundamental personality, that I could no longer imagine wanting to return to my original form. The tests continued for weeks, each one designed to evaluate different aspects of my potential value as an entertainment asset. Combat trials against opponents selected to challenge specific aspects of my enhanced abilities. Psychological evaluations to determine my resistance to various forms of mental manipulation. Social interaction studies to assess my ability to function in the complex political environment of Vect's court. But the most disturbing test was one that I didn't initially recognize as such. I was placed in a simulation of an Imperial Guard command bunker and asked to plan a defensive operation against an approaching enemy force. The scenario was detailed and realistic, based on actual battles that had been fought during my original military service. For the first time in years, I was being asked to think strategically rather than simply react tactically. The exercise should have been simple for someone with my original training and experience. But as I tried to develop a battle plan, I discovered that the modifications had altered my cognitive processes in ways I hadn't fully understood. The tactical reasoning that had once been my greatest strength had been fundamentally changed, optimized for individual combat rather than large-scale military operations. I could still analyze enemy positions and identify weaknesses in their formations, but I could no longer think about the broader strategic implications of military actions. My mind had been restructured to focus on immediate personal challenges rather than abstract concepts like duty, honor, or the welfare of subordinates. The person who had once been responsible for the lives of dozens of soldiers could now barely comprehend why such responsibility might matter. Fascinating, the evaluator noted as he reviewed my performance. The subject retains technical military knowledge but has lost the philosophical framework that gave that knowledge meaning. She can plan tactics but cannot understand strategy, can analyze threats but cannot comprehend purpose. This represents a perfect example of selective cognitive modification. The realization of what I had lost was more devastating than any physical injury I had suffered in the arenas. The Dark Eldar had not just changed my body or altered my emotions. They had surgically removed the parts of my personality that had made me capable of caring about anything beyond my immediate survival and performance. I was no longer capable of being the person who had sacrificed her career to protect a young soldier from unnecessary death. But even that realization was processed through the filter of my modified consciousness. Instead of feeling grief or rage at what had been taken from me, I experienced only a mild curiosity about the technical sophistication of the modification process. The capacity for outrage had been edited out of my personality matrix, replaced with appreciation for the artistry of my captor's work. The final evaluation was conducted by Vecht himself in a private audience chamber that defied every law of architecture and physics that had ever been discovered. The space seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, while the walls displayed live feeds from torture chambers, battlefields, and other sites of suffering throughout the galaxy. It was an environment designed to overwhelm the senses and intimidate visitors, but to my modified consciousness, it simply felt like an appropriately elaborate setting for an important business meeting. Vecht was ancient beyond human comprehension, his form preserved through technologies and techniques that had been perfected over millennia of absolute power. He moved with the fluid grace common to all Eldar, but there was something about him that suggested depths of cruelty that even other Dark Eldar found disturbing. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had shaped the destiny of entire civilizations through the simple exercise of his personal preferences. "You represent an interesting experiment," he said, studying me with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. "The modification techniques that created you have produced results that exceed normal parameters. But the question remains whether those results represent genuine improvement or simply random variation." He activated a holographic display that showed detailed scans of my modified physiology and psychology, comparing my current state to baseline measurements taken when I was first captured. The data revealed the full scope of the changes that had been made to transform me from human being to entertainment asset. "Your combat effectiveness has increased by approximately 400% over baseline human performance," he continued, highlighting specific areas of the data display. "Your pain tolerance has been enhanced by similar margins, while your capacity for independent moral reasoning has been reduced to negligible levels. From a purely utilitarian standpoint, you represent a significant improvement over your original design." But there was something in his tone that suggested he was not entirely satisfied with the results. As the evaluation continued, I began to understand that my success in the arenas had created an unexpected problem for my captors. By proving too effective at surviving their entertainment, I had become less entertaining. Audiences were beginning to expect my victory in any given contest, reducing the dramatic tension that made for compelling performances. "The challenge," Vecht explained, "is that success has made you predictable. The modifications that allow you to defeat your opponents also remove the uncertainty that makes combat entertaining. You have become too competent for your own good." He paused to make notations on a device that looked like crystallized thought, recording decisions that would shape my immediate future. There are several options for addressing this problem. We could modify you further, introducing artificial weaknesses that would make your contests more uncertain. We could assign you to opponents specifically designed to counter your enhanced abilities. Or we could retire you from active combat and repurpose you for other forms of entertainment. Each option represented a different form of destruction, a different way of discarding me once I had outlived my usefulness as a performing asset. The modifications that had kept me alive in the arenas had also made me too successful for continued arena service, creating a paradox that could only be resolved by finding new ways to exploit my modified nature. However, Vecht continued, there is a fourth option that may provide the most interesting results. You could be assigned to my personal retinue as a specialized enforcement asset, someone whose modifications make them ideal for handling problems that require both combat skill and absolute loyalty. The offer was presented as an opportunity for advancement, a chance to rise above my current status and serve at the highest levels of Dark Eldar society. But I could see that it was simply another form of exploitation, another way of extracting value from the modifications that had been made to my body and mind. Instead of fighting in arenas for public entertainment, I would be fighting in shadows for private purposes. But the modified consciousness that governed my decision-making processes interpreted the offer in terms of opportunity and advancement rather than continued exploitation. The programming that had been built into my personality made me genuinely grateful for the chance to serve a more prestigious master, regardless of what that service might entail. I am honored by your confidence in my abilities, I heard myself saying, though the words came from conditioning rather than genuine sentiment. I will serve to the best of my capabilities in whatever capacity you deem appropriate. Vecht smiled, an expression that contained no warmth but significant satisfaction. Excellent. Your first assignment will be to eliminate a rival who has been interfering with certain business interests. The target is a fellow Archon whose continued existence has become inconvenient. Your modifications should make you ideal for this type of work. And so I transitioned from arena gladiator to personal assassin, trading public performances for private killings, but never escaping the fundamental reality of my situation. I was still property, still a tool to be used for purposes I could not question or resist. The modifications that had made me successful in one form of service simply made me suitable for another form of exploitation. The years that followed were filled with assignments that took me throughout Camera and beyond, carrying out tasks that required the unique combination of capabilities that my modifications had provided. I eliminated rivals, recovered stolen property, conducted negotiations that required the implicit threat of lethal force. Each assignment was successful, each mission completed according to specifications. But with each passing year, I became less human, less capable of remembering what I had been before the modifications began. The woman who had been Lieutenant Sarah Chen existed only in fragmentary memories that seemed increasingly like fiction, stories about someone who had never really existed. What remained was Subject 47, a perfectly functional biological weapon that happened to retain some residual human characteristics. The most disturbing aspect of my current existence was not the violence or the exploitation, but the contentment. The modifications had not just changed my capabilities, they had altered my reward mechanisms so that I derived genuine satisfaction from serving my captor's purposes. I felt pride when assignments were completed successfully, pleasure when my performance exceeded expectations, gratitude when I was given new opportunities to demonstrate my usefulness. I had become the perfect slave, not someone who was forced to serve against their will, but someone who genuinely wanted to serve, who found meaning and purpose in activities that benefited their owners rather than themselves. The Dark Eldar had achieved something that simple coercion could never have accomplished. They had made me complicit in my own exploitation by programming me to believe that exploitation was actually fulfillment. And in the darkness of the 41st millennium, where there is only war, even the process of breaking down and rebuilding consciousness had become an industrial art. The Dark Eldar had perfected techniques for transforming captured beings into willing tools, creating armies of slaves who genuinely believed that their enslavement was a form of liberation. The woman who had once served the Emperor as Lieutenant Sarah Chen was gone, replaced by something that bore her face but served alien masters with enthusiasm that would have horrified her original consciousness. But that original consciousness was no longer capable of being horrified, having been systematically edited and replaced with programming designed to find satisfaction in service rather than freedom in resistance. In the twisted spires of Kamara, among beings whose entire civilization was built around the cultivation of suffering, I had found my place as a perfectly crafted instrument of their will. The modifications had not just changed what I could do, they had changed what I wanted to do, creating a harmony between my capabilities and desires that made resistance not just impossible, but literally unthinkable. The Emperor protects. They had taught me in my former life. But in the depths of the Dark City, I had learned that there are some fates from which no protection is possible. Some forms of destruction so complete that the victim becomes grateful for their own annihilation. I was living proof that the human spirit could be not just broken, but rebuilt, transformed into something that served purposes antithetical to everything humanity claimed to value. And I was content with what I had become, because contentment was the only emotion my modified consciousness was still capable of experiencing in relation to my own existence.